Avoidants secretly hope you do this when they stonewall. There is a specific kind of pain that comes from watching someone go emotionally blank right in front of you. One day they are warm, engaged, connected, and the next it feels like somebody shut a door without warning and left you standing outside in the cold, holding conversations that no longer have a place to land. The messages become shorter, the energy changes, the affection disappears from their voice. And suddenly your mind starts racing through every possible explanation because silence is one of the loudest emotional triggers a human being can experience, especially when the silence comes from someone you deeply care about. You replay your last conversation 100 times, you analyze punctuation, you check timestamps, you convince yourself there must be one perfect thing you can say that will reopen the connection again. But the harder you push emotionally, the more distant they seem to become, and that creates one of the most psychologically addictive cycles imaginable because now you are no longer just trying to connect, you are trying to escape the anxiety their silence created inside you. And if you have ever felt yourself emotionally unraveling while waiting for an avoidant to come back emotionally, subscribe to the channel right now because what you are about to hear may completely change the way you understand silence, withdrawal, and emotional shutdown forever. The first thing people misunderstand about stonewalling is assuming it always comes from cruelty or lack of care. Sometimes it does. Sometimes people absolutely use silence to punish, manipulate, or control. But with avoidance, the psychology is often more complicated than that. Many avoidants do not go silent because they feel nothing. They go silent because they feel too much internally and do not know how to process it safely in real time. Emotional conflict overwhelms their nervous system quickly. Intense conversations can make them feel cornered, exposed, criticized, or emotionally trapped. So instead of leaning into the discomfort and communicating openly, they shut down to regain emotional control internally. Silence becomes their coping mechanism. Distance becomes their emotional oxygen. And from the outside, this behavior feels unbelievably confusing because the avoidant may have been loving just days earlier. They may have seemed emotionally invested. But the moment tension, vulnerability, or emotional pressure enters the relationship, something inside them instinctively pulls backward. This is why stonewalling hurts so deeply, not only because of the silence itself, but because the silence creates emotional whiplash. One moment you feel connected, the next moment you feel emotionally erased, and human beings naturally panic when connection suddenly disappears without explanation. Your nervous system starts treating the silence like danger. That is why so many people spiral emotionally during avoidant withdrawal, even when they intellectually know they should stay calm. And unfortunately, that panic often creates the exact reaction avoidants secretly fear most. The chasing begins, the repeated texts, the emotional paragraphs, the "can we just talk" messages sent late at night after hours of overthinking. The desperate attempts to pull emotional clarity out of someone who is actively retreating from emotional intensity. And the reason this usually backfires is because avoidants interpret emotional urgency very differently than anxious people do. To the person chasing, the behavior feels loving, honest, necessary. They believe they are trying to save the relationship before it drifts further away. But to the avoidant nervous system, that emotional pursuit can feel like overwhelming pressure. Every additional message increases the sense that they are being emotionally cornered before they have had time to regulate internally. So instead of reopening emotionally, they retreat even deeper into silence. This is the brutal irony most people never realize until it is too late. The more emotionally desperate your energy becomes during stonewalling, the safer silence starts feeling to the avoidant, because silence becomes the only space where they no longer feel emotionally demanded from. Meanwhile, the person chasing becomes even more distressed because the lack of response intensifies feelings of abandonment. So now both people are trapped in opposite survival responses, one pursuing connection frantically, the other escaping emotional overwhelm through withdrawal. What makes this dynamic even more painful is that beneath the avoidance silence there is often a hidden fear most people never see. Avoidants are not always running from you specifically. Many are running from what closeness emotionally activates inside themselves. Conflict can trigger shame. Vulnerability can trigger fear of inadequacy. Emotional confrontation can trigger memories of feeling controlled, criticized, engulfed, or emotionally unsafe earlier in life. So when tension appears in a relationship, avoidants often experience a powerful internal urge to protect themselves emotionally before they even consciously understand what is happening. That is why some avoidants go cold immediately during difficult conversations. Their nervous system is prioritizing emotional self-protection over connection, And this is important to understand because people often personalize the silence completely. They assume if they truly loved me, they would communicate. But avoidant shutdown is often less about lack of feeling and more about lack of emotional capacity in overwhelming moments. The problem is that their silence still creates real emotional damage for the other person regardless of the intention behind it. Because prolonged emotional shutdown leaves the other partner suspended in uncertainty, anxiety, and confusion. Human beings are not built to feel emotionally connected one day and emotionally invisible the next without consequences. That uncertainty can become psychologically consuming, especially for people with abandonment wounds. And when those wounds get triggered, the desire to force clarity becomes almost irresistible, which leads directly into one of the biggest mistakes people make during avoidant stonewalling, applying emotional pressure in hopes of creating emotional closeness. Most people believe intensity will break through the wall. They think if they explain their pain clearly enough, emotionally enough, passionately enough, the avoidant will finally understand the damage being caused and reconnect. But avoidants rarely respond well to emotional force. In fact, pressure usually extends the silence. The repeated demands for immediate communication, the guilt-driven messages, the emotional ultimatums, the constant attempts to pull reassurance out of someone already emotionally overwhelmed. These behaviors often confirm the avoidant's deepest fear that intimacy eventually becomes emotionally consuming. So instead of softening toward the relationship, they shut down harder. And this is where many people unknowingly destroy the possibility of healthy reconnection because they become so consumed by the need to end the silence that they lose emotional regulation completely. Their entire emotional world starts revolving around getting a response. But what avoidants secretly hope for during stonewalling is not emotional escalation. They secretly hope the other person will remain emotionally grounded enough not to turn the silence into emotional chaos. Because when someone reacts with calmness instead of panic, it lowers the avoidant's internal sense of threat. It gives them space to breathe emotionally without feeling hunted by someone else's fear. And understanding that difference changes everything about how these dynamics unfold. The difficult truth is that avoidants often secretly hope you will not chase the silence, not because they enjoy hurting you, not because they want emotional games, but because when someone responds to stonewalling with emotional restraint instead of emotional panic, it changes the emotional atmosphere completely. Most avoidants expect conflict to escalate. They expect emotional intensity, accusations, desperate pursuit, or pressure to explain themselves before they have internally processed anything. So when someone stays calm instead of emotionally flooding them, it interrupts that expectation. Suddenly, the avoidant no longer feels trapped inside another person's emotional urgency. They feel space. And space is incredibly important to avoidants because space allows their nervous system to regulate without feeling emotionally cornered. This is why one of the most powerful things you can do during avoidant withdrawal is stop trying to force immediate emotional resolution. That does not mean becoming cold or emotionally unavailable yourself. It means remaining connected to your own center instead of abandoning yourself to the anxiety of the silence. Because the moment your entire emotional state starts revolving around whether they respond, the silence gains psychological control over you. And avoidants can feel that desperation immediately. They sense when someone's emotional stability is collapsing around the need for reassurance. But when someone can experience uncertainty without emotionally unraveling, it creates a completely different dynamic. The avoidant no longer feels responsible for managing another person's panic on top of their own internal overwhelm. And strangely enough, that emotional steadiness often creates more safety for reconnection than emotional pursuit ever could. This is why calmness affects avoidance so deeply. Calmness does not mean pretending you are unaffected. It means your emotions are not driving impulsive behavior every second. There is a massive difference between feeling hurt and becoming emotionally chaotic. Avoidants are highly sensitive to emotional intensity because many of them subconsciously associate intense emotional reactions with loss of control, conflict, shame, or emotional suffocation. So when someone reacts to silence with explosive emotions, repeated demands, or constant pressure, the avoidant's nervous system interprets the relationship as emotionally unsafe. But when someone responds with grounded energy, patience, and emotional regulation, the avoidant experiences something rare: closeness without immediate pressure. And that distinction matters more than most people realize. Healthy calmness communicates, I care about this relationship, but I am still emotionally anchored within myself. Desperation communicates, my emotional stability depends entirely on your response. One creates emotional safety, the other creates emotional responsibility. and avoidants instinctively retreat from feeling emotionally responsible for another person's internal world. This is why emotionally regulated people often affect avoidance differently. Their energy feels lighter, safer, more breathable. They do not chase every silence like it is a life or death emergency. They do not collapse every time emotional distance appears, and because of that, avoidants often feel less pressure and more curiosity around them naturally. At the same time, it is important to understand the difference between healthy space and emotional abandonment because many people become confused here. Giving space does not mean accepting endless emotional neglect. It does not mean silencing your needs forever just to avoid pushing someone away. Healthy space is temporary emotional breathing room that still exists within mutual respect and care. Emotional abandonment is when someone repeatedly disappears, shuts down communication indefinitely, or leaves you emotionally stranded without accountability. Those are not the same thing. And this distinction matters because people trapped in avoidant dynamics often start questioning their own emotional needs entirely. They convince themselves they are too much simply because they want communication, reassurance, or consistency. But wanting emotional clarity does not make you needy. The problem begins when the pursuit of clarity becomes emotionally compulsive, when your nervous system becomes so activated by silence that you start sacrificing your self-respect just to restore connection. Healthy space still allows room for your dignity. It still honors your emotional reality. It simply avoids turning moments of disconnection into emotional warfare, because the goal is not to emotionally smother the avoidant back into closeness. The goal is to create conditions where reconnection feels emotionally safe rather than emotionally forced. And ironically, that becomes impossible when one person completely abandons themselves during every period of distance. Something else many people never realize is that avoidants are often watching your reaction during stonewalling far more closely than they admit. Even in silence, they are paying attention. They are observing whether conflict turns you emotionally unstable, whether you become vindictive, manipulative, controlling, or self-destructive, whether your emotions become overwhelming the moment emotional uncertainty enters the relationship. This does not mean avoidants are consciously testing people in some calculated way. Much of it happens subconsciously. Their nervous system is scanning for emotional danger constantly because intimacy itself already feels vulnerable to them. So when someone reacts to silence with emotional chaos, it reinforces the avoidance belief that closeness eventually becomes emotionally unsafe. But when someone remains composed, honest, and emotionally mature during difficult moments, the avoidant often feels less threatened by the relationship over time. And this is one of the hardest realities for anxious partners to accept because emotional restraint feels counterintuitive when your abandonment fears are screaming for reassurance. Your instincts tell you to close the distance immediately, to solve the tension instantly, to demand certainty now before the anxiety consumes you. But avoidants often interpret that urgency as emotional pressure rather than love, which means the very behavior meant to restore connection can unintentionally prolong the disconnection instead. That is exactly why trying to force the conversation almost always backfires with avoidance. The more someone demands immediate emotional processing, the more trapped the avoidant tends to feel internally. Imagine already feeling emotionally overwhelmed, ashamed, confused, or flooded, and then simultaneously feeling pressured to perform emotional clarity before you are regulated enough to access it. That pressure often creates shutdown rather than openness. Avoidants are rarely at their most emotionally honest when they feel cornered. In fact, many will say whatever ends the emotional intensity fastest, not necessarily what reflects their deeper feelings accurately. That is why forced conversations after stonewalling often feel unsatisfying or emotionally incomplete. The avoidant may reopen communication physically while still remaining emotionally closed internally. Real reconnection usually happens when emotional pressure lowers enough for authenticity to return naturally, and that process cannot be rushed through desperation. It requires emotional maturity from both sides, the ability to tolerate discomfort without becoming destructive, the ability to communicate needs without emotional coercion, and most importantly, the ability to stay connected to yourself while someone else is temporarily disconnected from you. Because the moment another person's silence completely destroys your emotional stability, the relationship stops being about connection and starts becoming about survival. And no healthy intimacy can grow when both people are operating entirely from fear. What emotional maturity actually looks like during stonewalling is far less dramatic than most people imagine. It is not about becoming emotionless. It is not about pretending you are unaffected by the silence. Emotional maturity is the ability to experience pain without allowing pain to control your behavior completely. It is the decision to pause before sending the 10th message. It is resisting the urge to turn anxiety into accusations. It is allowing yourself to feel hurt without making another person responsible for instantly removing that hurt on demand. And this becomes incredibly important in avoidant dynamics because avoidants often expect emotional conflict to become chaotic. They expect closeness to eventually lead to emotional flooding, criticism, or pressure. So when someone responds to silence with grounded communication instead of emotional collapse, it creates a very different emotional experience for them. Mature energy says, I respect myself enough not to abandon my emotional stability just because this moment is uncomfortable. And that kind of energy quietly changes the power of the dynamic, because the relationship stops revolving around emotional survival and starts revolving around emotional awareness instead. The person being stonewalled no longer loses themselves completely inside the uncertainty. They continue living, continue functioning, continue protecting their own peace while still remaining emotionally honest. And ironically, this emotional steadiness often creates more possibility for healthy reconnection because the avoidant no longer feels emotionally hunted by another person's panic. But there is another trap many people fall into after learning this information. They confuse emotional control with emotional detachment. So instead of becoming grounded, they become performative. They start pretending they do not care. They post indirect messages online hoping the avoidant notices. They intentionally ignore texts to regain power. They force themselves into artificial coldness because they believe appearing unaffected will make the avoidant chase them back emotionally. But avoidants are often surprisingly sensitive to emotional authenticity. They can usually feel the difference between genuine emotional regulation and silent resentment disguised as independence. Real emotional control is peaceful. Manipulative detachment feels emotionally tense underneath the surface. One comes from self-respect, the other comes from wounded pride trying to regain emotional leverage. And this distinction matters because fake detachment still keeps your emotional world centered around the avoidant. You are still reacting to them constantly, just in the opposite direction now. Real emotional grounding is different. It is when your emotional stability no longer depends on controlling the avoidance behavior or forcing a specific outcome. You stop obsessing over how to make them respond. You stop building your entire emotional reality around whether they return emotionally or not. And when that happens, your energy naturally changes. You become less emotionally reactive, less consumed by the silence, less desperate to force certainty. And ironically, avoidants often feel safer reconnecting with people whose emotional world does not immediately collapse every time distance enters the relationship. At the same time, many avoidants are experiencing far more internal conflict during silence than they ever reveal outwardly. This is something people misunderstand constantly. They assume the avoidant feels nothing because the avoidant appears calm externally, but many avoidants miss the person deeply while simultaneously resisting the urge to reconnect. They think about reaching out while also fearing the emotional intensity that might return if they do. They crave connection while fearing engulfment at the exact same time. And this internal contradiction creates enormous emotional confusion inside them. Silence becomes both protection and loneliness simultaneously. That is why avoidants sometimes disappear emotionally for days or weeks, only to suddenly return with a random message, a small gesture, or subtle attempt to reopen the connection carefully. They often want closeness in controlled doses that do not overwhelm their nervous system. But because they struggle communicating vulnerability directly, their reconnection attempts can appear inconsistent, confusing, or emotionally incomplete. Meanwhile, the anxious partner usually interprets the silence in extreme ways. They assume the avoidant has stopped caring entirely. They catastrophize every moment of distance because uncertainty activates abandonment wounds so intensely. And this is why avoidant anxious dynamics become so psychologically exhausting. Both people are often operating from fear while misunderstanding each other's behavior completely. One fears emotional engulfment, the other fears emotional abandonment. One creates distance to feel safe, the other pursues closeness to feel safe. And unless both people become conscious of these patterns, the relationship can become an endless cycle of mutual triggering and emotional exhaustion. This is exactly why your self-respect becomes one of the most important things during avoidant stonewalling. Self-respect is not loud. It is not about ego or punishment. It is the quiet decision not to destroy yourself emotionally trying to hold on to someone else. It is maintaining your routines even when your mind wants to obsess over the silence. It is continuing to take care of your body, your goals, your friendships, and your emotional well-being instead of allowing the relationship to consume your entire identity. And avoidants often respond differently when they sense this kind of grounded self-respect because it removes emotional pressure from the connection. The relationship no longer feels like the other person's entire emotional survival system. There is space again, breathing room again. But more importantly, self-respect protects you, because no matter how much empathy you have for avoidance, prolonged stonewalling can become deeply emotionally damaging when it happens repeatedly without accountability. Many people become so focused on understanding the avoidant that they completely abandon understanding themselves. They normalize anxiety, they normalize emotional confusion, they normalize constantly waiting for crumbs of connection. And eventually their entire nervous system becomes trapped in hypervigilance, constantly scanning for signs the avoidant is emotionally available again. But healthy love should not require you